Pam Bondi entered the exchange with Repser Jasmine Crockett, armed with confidence and a clear goal, to land a rhetorical blow that would discredit and embarrass her opponent. From the very start, the energy was tense. You could sense that Bondi expected the interaction to unfold on her terms, with her in control of the narrative. She delivered her questions and comments with a tone that dripped with condescension, trying to frame Crockett as either uninformed or evasive. It was the classic setup: pose as the calm interrogator while implying your opponent is flustered or dishonest. But the problem with that strategy is simple. It only works if the person you're confronting actually falls for it. Jasmine Crockett didn't. From the moment Crockett responded, it was clear the dynamic Bondi had hoped to establish wasn't going to take root. Crockett's tone was measured, her words deliberate, and her command of the facts immediate. Rather than being rattled by the confrontational nature of the exchange, she seemed to welcome it, almost like she had been expecting this exact play. Bondi tried to press her, layering her comments with passive-aggressive smirks and rhetorical traps designed to provoke a misstep. But Crockett didn't bite. Instead, she dismantled the setup calmly and methodically, exposing the weaknesses in Bondi's framing without ever losing her composure. There's a unique type of tension in moments like these, when someone realizes the trap they've laid isn't going to spring the way they expected. You could almost see it on Bondi's face. A flicker of doubt, followed by the classic tell, repetition. She began circling back on her points, rephrasing her questions, hoping that Crockett would eventually stumble or say something she could pounce on. But Crockett remained unshaken. She pushed back, but not with over-the-top emotion or dramatics. Instead, she used poise as a weapon. She countered every point not just with opinion, but with fact. Every time Bondi tried to redirect or obfuscate, Crockett brought it back to the core issue with precision. What made the moment so powerful wasn't just the content, it was the contrast in styles. Bondi's approach relied on control, on asserting dominance through tone and framing. She counted on her ability to steer the conversation, assuming Crockett would respond defensively or get flustered. But Crockett's demeanor shifted that balance entirely. Her quiet intensity and unshakable calm turned the pressure back around. Instead of defending herself, she subtly forced Bondi to clarify, to defend her framing, to explain the inconsistencies in her logic. And once the roles reversed, the whole dynamic of the conversation collapsed on Bondi. There's a difference between being assertive and being aggressive, and Crockett understood that distinction perfectly. She didn't need to raise her voice or interrupt to make her points land. She used timing, tone, and clarity to shift the momentum. With each passing exchange, it became more apparent that the strategy Bondi entered with was faltering. The energy she had at the start, confident, assertive, almost smug, began to give way to frustration masked as composure. Meanwhile, Crockett only became more grounded. That's the moment where the power in a conversation flips, when the person who intended to dominate realizes they're not the one leading anymore. Bondi began the exchange thinking she had the upper hand, expecting that her experience, demeanor, or platform would naturally grant her control. But that illusion fell apart when Crockett didn't play along. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't give the viral meltdown or defensive retreat that Bondi seemed to be aiming for. Instead, she delivered something far more devastating, a controlled and unflinching response that exposed the weakness of Bondi's assumptions. There's something deeply effective about composure under fire, especially in a high-stakes public moment. Crockett didn't just respond, she performed. But not in a flashy or theatrical way. She performed in the sense of executing exactly what was needed, when it was needed, without ever letting the moment overwhelm her. That type of presence flips the emotional charge of the conversation. Suddenly, the aggressor looks desperate. The setup backfires. And the person who was supposed to be on defense is now the one asking the unanswerable questions, through both words and demeanor. By the time the exchange had played out, the outcome was clear. Not because of a loud moment or a dramatic exit, but because of the undeniable feeling that one person had miscalculated, and the other had quietly turned the entire encounter into a showcase of rhetorical precision. Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond to an attack. She turned the entire moment into a masterclass in tactical communication. The instant the condescension came her way, she shifted gears, not into outrage or defensiveness, but into something far more dangerous for her opponent: clarity and precision. There was no hesitation in her voice, no signs of intimidation. Instead, she calmly dissected the situation, addressing both the substance and the style of what was being thrown at her. It was clear she wasn't there to play into the spectacle. She didn't rely on volume or emotion to make her point. Her strength came from control. She paced her response, deliberately choosing words that cut through the noise and forced a shift in tone. Her demeanor alone created a noticeable contrast with the passive-aggressive framing of the attack. The strategy was unmistakable: make her look unsure, push her into a flustered reaction, and capitalize on the performance. But that only works when the target cooperates. Crockett didn't. What made her clapback so effective wasn't that it was loud, but that it was exact. She didn't rely on broad statements or vague retorts. She zeroed in on the logical flaws and contradictions in the way the conversation had been framed. She called out the double standards, the cherry-picking of narratives, and did so with a tone that conveyed both intelligence and subtle defiance. Her words landed because they weren't rehearsed. They were reactive, sharp, and grounded in reality. She understood the moment. Not just the politics of it, but the optics. She knew how it would look. The attempts to talk over her, the tone of disrespect, the thinly veiled attempt to paint her as less competent or informed. It was all part of a script that many have seen before. But instead of resisting it with emotion, she made it obvious by staying calm. That composure didn't just protect her from the trap, it reversed the trap entirely. She didn't just defend herself, she repositioned herself as the one in control. That's the part that made the clapback resonate. It wasn't just a good moment in the argument, it was a power shift. Each word, each pause, each correction she made was laced with meaning. She reminded everyone watching that she wasn't afraid of confrontation, but she wasn't going to be bullied into one either. She could sit in the fire, unfazed, and still deliver lines that left an impression. The power of her rebuttal didn't come from personal attacks or snarky one-liners. It came from how she dismantled the narrative being imposed on her. She exposed the tactic, undermining a speaker by pretending to engage in civil discourse while actually executing a condescending ambush. Crockett saw it for what it was and responded in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. She used the very structure of the moment, the question, the tone, the framing, as evidence of the bias and imbalance she was being subjected to. You could tell the impact was immediate. The silence that followed some of her points wasn't just about moving on, it was a pause of realization. Her opponent, who had entered with full confidence, suddenly had to recalibrate. The strategy wasn't working. Instead of looking unprepared, Crockett looked unbothered. Instead of seeming unsure, she appeared unshakable. And in moments like that, where perception carries as much weight as substance, the shift is everything. She used elegance as a shield. She responded to tone with fact, to distortion with clarity. The more she spoke, the more it became apparent that she wasn't there to be reactive. She was proactive. She anticipated the angles and was ready to counter them without getting caught in the emotional trap. Her intelligence wasn't just in what she said, but in how she said it. Cool, strategic, and always returning the focus to the actual issue rather than the performance her opponent was trying to provoke. What sets that kind of clapback apart is its longevity. It's not just a good moment in a heated exchange, it becomes a defining moment. A shift where the intended target refuses to play the role that's been assigned to them and instead flips the narrative without ever having to say, "I won." Because the win is self-evident. It's in the way the crowd reacts, in the way the momentum shifts, in the visible change of tone from the other side. It's the kind of moment that lives on because it wasn't loud. It was right, and that made it unforgettable. The shift in energy wasn't subtle, it was palpable. As the exchange unfolded and the tension built, the reaction from those watching began to change dramatically. At first, the confrontation seemed set up to provoke an embarrassing stumble, a kind of gotcha moment aimed at diminishing Jasmine Crockett's credibility. But what happened instead was a complete reversal of expectations, and the reaction from the audience, whether in the room or across social platforms, reflected that turn with overwhelming clarity. There's a certain electricity in the air when someone unexpectedly turns the tables in a high-pressure situation. At the beginning, it might have seemed like Crockett was being cornered, with the intent to make her appear evasive or ill-prepared. Yet, the moment she opened her mouth to respond, the entire mood started to change. Her poise under pressure wasn't just impressive, it was commanding. Each time she responded with precision and calm defiance, the energy in the room shifted another degree in her favor. People notice those moments when someone refuses to be rattled. They resonate because they challenge expectations. Instead of seeing a person backpedal or become defensive, the audience saw confidence, control, and an undeniable grip on the facts. That kind of response doesn't just neutralize an attack, it flips the emotional dynamic. Suddenly, it's not the person being questioned who looks nervous or uncertain, it's the one asking the questions. The silence between each answer became heavier, more awkward. The visual cues began to shift. The interviewer's tone tightened, body language stiffened, and the usual rhythm of dominance evaporated. It was in those seconds, when attempted, interruptions were calmly brushed aside, and when Crockett doubled down on her clarity, that the audience began to lean in differently. What started as a moment of anticipated weakness transformed into a showcase of strength. Viewers could feel it. She wasn't just surviving this exchange, she was owning it. And the more composed she became, the more unprepared her opponent looked by comparison. The shift didn't go unnoticed. People watching at home, online, and even in the immediate space were reacting in real time. Clips began circulating within minutes. Reactions flooded in, not with confusion or controversy, but with recognition. There's something undeniably powerful about watching someone stay cool while under targeted pressure. It strikes a chord, particularly when those tactics are so familiar. The performance being attempted, covertly aggressive, packaged as professional, wasn't new. But Crockett's dismantling of it, that hit different. The response was visceral. Social media lit up with comments praising her composure, her wit, and her refusal to be drawn into a false narrative. People weren't just impressed, they were inspired. It was more than just a political moment, it was a cultural one. That kind of control in a hostile setting felt like vindication, especially for those who've seen similar tactics used against people who aren't supposed to push back. Crockett didn't just push back, she pushed through, and the audience loved it. There's a unique kind of silence that happens when someone realizes they've lost the room. It's not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just the pause. After a failed comeback, the narrowing eyes of someone who's grasping for control that's already slipped away. That's what happened here. The more Crockett stood her ground, the more evident it became that her opponent had underestimated her, and the audience was no longer buying the original premise of the confrontation. Even those who might not have been familiar with her before the exchange were now fully engaged. You could sense the collective shift. This wasn't just someone responding to an attack, this was someone commanding attention. The usual power dynamics, the ones that rely on controlling tone and framing, were completely disrupted. And it was all done without shouting, without personal attacks, and without theatrics. The audience reaction said everything. It was in the retweets, the clipped quotes, the breakdown videos, and the shared sentiments that kept popping up again and again. She handled that. It's rare to see such unified response across a broad spectrum of viewers, but that's what made this moment stand out. The attempted takedown didn't just fail, it backfired spectacularly, and the people watching knew it immediately. The moment the clip hit the internet, it was clear something had shifted. Within hours, social feeds were flooded with reactions, quotes, video snippets, and commentary dissecting every second of the exchange. The moment had caught fire, and Jasmine Crockett's name was everywhere. What made it spread so quickly wasn't just the content of the exchange, It was the unmistakable feeling that something powerful had just happened. People could sense the authenticity, the control, and the sheer command she exhibited, and they responded to it with intensity. It's not every day that a political moment breaks out of its usual echo chambers, but this one did. It wasn't just political junkies or media outlets commenting. It was everyday people, celebrities, and commentators from across the spectrum reacting to what they had just witnessed. There was a collective recognition. This wasn't just someone defending themselves. This was someone stepping fully into their voice and making it impossible to ignore. The video wasn't just being shared. It was being celebrated, remixed, replayed, and captioned with words like iconic, masterclass, and unbothered. The virality didn't come from shock value or chaos. It came from control. Crockett's calm, deliberate responses in the face of provocation struck a nerve because they exposed a power dynamic in real time and reversed it. Viewers could see the original attempt, frame her as ill-informed or unprofessional, and then exploit any emotional reaction as proof. But what actually happened was the exact opposite. She stayed calm, focused, and sharp, and the only narrative that stuck was her complete command of the moment. That's why it resonated. People recognized the tactic she was being subjected to, and they were thrilled to watch her dismantle it, without breaking a sweat. As the momentum built, headlines followed. Articles began surfacing, praising her composure and precision. Media outlets ran segments on the exchange, replaying key moments and analyzing her responses. The conversation expanded beyond the original context, spilling into discussions about double standards, representation, and how effective communication can expose bias without ever needing to name it outright. She didn't just win a moment. She sparked a larger conversation, one that gave people language and clarity for situations they've seen too many times before. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. It mattered that she didn't yell. It mattered that she didn't get defensive. She simply held her ground and let her clarity do the talking. That kind of restraint, especially when you're being spoken down to or maneuvered into a rhetorical corner, is a skill that goes beyond debate. It's leadership. And people saw that. They saw the strength it takes to not only remain poised under pressure, but to actually turn that pressure into fuel. They didn't just see someone survive an attack, they saw someone thrive in it. The internet rewards authenticity, especially when it's paired with grace under fire. That's why this moment caught on the way it did. It wasn't staged or rehearsed. It wasn't crafted in a PR war room. It was real. And the realness of it, the visible refusal to be diminished, the steady assertion of her position, was exactly what made people rally around her. She became more than a participant in a televised exchange. She became a symbol of how to hold power without aggression, how to respond to bias without being baited, and how to make yourself heard without ever raising your voice. The comments pouring in weren't just support, they were recognition. People were quoting her lines, echoing her cadence, and even using her words as responses in unrelated conversations. Memes were made, t-shirts were designed, edits layered her responses with music, visual effects, and fanfare. It wasn't mockery or irony, it was celebration. It was appreciation for how rare it is to see someone not just handle a difficult moment, but completely redefine it. She didn't ask for the spotlight, but once it found her, she didn't flinch. And that kind of authenticity, especially when it intersects with intelligence and timing, is something that no algorithm can ignore. By the end of the day, she was trending. Not because she sought attention, but because attention was inevitable. The force of her presence, the clarity of her words, and the visual of someone refusing to be undermined. It created a viral moment rooted in something deeper than spectacle. It was a performance of competence, control, and calm resistance that stuck with people. It wasn't just a highlight, it was a turning point, and the internet responded accordingly. What unfolded in that exchange was more than a political moment. It was a cultural imprint. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend her position, she modeled how to face down condescension with strategy, how to counter bias with balance, and how to meet provocation with poise. In doing so, she carved out a space not just for herself in that moment, but for others watching who have experienced the same kind of subtle dismissal or overt challenge and wondered how best to respond. She didn't shout anyone down. She didn't resort to personal attacks. She simply stood her ground with clarity and confidence, and in doing so, she showed that strength can be quiet and devastatingly effective. The exchange also laid bare a broader truth. The tactics used to undermine individuals, especially women of color, are often wrapped in civility, disguised as debate or concern. But when someone like Crockett calmly exposes the flaws in those tactics without playing into the emotion of the moment, it forces a reckoning. It makes people watching reconsider what they've accepted as normal or fair, and that ripple effect matters. Moments like this don't go viral simply because they're dramatic. They resonate because they're relatable. The reaction wasn't just about cheering for a political win. It was about recognition, of grace under pressure, of unjust expectations, of power dynamics flipped. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were moved. They saw a reflection of their own struggles in Crockett's calm resolve, and they felt empowered by the way she handled herself. That kind of connection is rare, and it speaks to why the moment had such staying power. It also serves as a reminder that substance still matters. In a media landscape dominated by noise and spectacle, it's easy to assume that the loudest voice wins. But Crockett's performance cut through all of that because it wasn't about volume, it was about presence. Her responses were grounded, informed, and delivered with purpose. That's what left the lasting impression. That's why people continued talking about it, sharing it, and learning from it. Ultimately, the moment wasn't about humiliation or victory. It was about visibility. It was about watching someone meet an unfair setup with intelligence and refusing to be minimized by it. Crockett didn't just hold her own, she elevated the conversation. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that dignity, when paired with truth and timing, is one of the most powerful tools anyone can bring into a room. The clip might be short, but its impact stretched far beyond its runtime. It sparked a conversation, shifted a dynamic, and solidified a voice that's impossible to ignore.